So if it wasn't now for a Sunday World team following this rapist, a guy called Francis Condra, who's changed his name to Hasan Selim while in prison, tracking him to England, to the northwest of England's London, outside London, isn't it? Northwest London. And photographed him with his totally new look.
Yeah.
There would be nobody who'd have a clue who he was. So he's convicted of a very serious rape. We're going to go into the detail of that. He goes into prison and changes his name by deed poll.
Yeah.
And he changes his image completely. So he comes out of prison.
Yeah.
With the conviction, he's on the sex offenders register, but he can just go to ground, go into the community in the UK, in London, and nobody will have a clue about his background.
No, I mean, he's converted to Islam. That was that happened in prison. So there is a belief that he's gone into the UK and will, go into that world, which was even less likely to know about his movements in Ireland, because, of course, he became...
Unless they Google him now, because if they Google his new name or his old name, they'll find this story, which is at least a bit of a public service in one way.
Yeah, and Francis Condra became very notorious for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons was the extremely, what was described by the guards in court as barbaric and one of the worst rape cases they'd ever come across. A very experienced officer said that. But also Francis Condra was an odd sort of character. Before this rape was committed and he was convicted of it in 2006, he'd previously served a couple of sentences, one for a kind of burglary on a very old age pensioner and an armed robbery, a role in an armed robbery. While he was in prison at that stage, he'd become a playwright. He'd written a play, and then he became a kind of a much fated campaigner for social justice.
So just before you go on there, he became a playwright, or he wrote a play in prison?
Well, he wrote a play in prison.
Which was ever staged?
No, it was staged.
In prison or outside?
No, outside. I mean, it was produced in the Dublin Fringe Festival, and it was also in the Drogheda Arts Centre. So, and at that stage, there was a number of glowing interviews with him, speaking about his rehabilitation,
turning his back on crime, and
not just turning his back on crime, but also his campaign for people to recognise that prisoners have this right to rehabilitation. When the play was launched, it was John Lonigan, for example, the former governor of Mountjoy, came to watch it, and there was a number of these kind of glowing tributes with him where he spoke about, for example, he wanted to raise awareness of the Irish prison system, and how it needed to be geared more towards rehabilitation and less towards punishment culture, about how he committed crimes as a result of his addiction, and that he had been reformed. And he did a series of these kind of interviews.
And listen, can we just say at this point, it's a rarity that, you get these, what would you call them, model prisoners, or these prisoners that are articulate enough to come out and discuss all that, discuss rehabilitation, discuss what life is like behind bars, who can embrace everything that's offered them behind bars and move their lives on. Most of them stay on the straight and narrow, those guys, right? Those artists and everybody else that comes out. Francis Condra didn't. And ended up back in jail for this rape. But so he was basically sort of marketing himself as such, as a campaigner, getting quite a healthy profile with these media interviews. So he was somebody that had been in jail, albeit for a violent criminal past, but had come out, and should you have looked up what he was doing or anything, he'd be somebody you might have admired.
Somebody you might have admired. He was certainly working with the homeless a lot. There's a journalist we work with, who I won't mention her name, had worked with him in a homeless hostel. I had actually come across him myself through, I won't even go into that, but I come across him a couple of times through that kind of arts world, I suppose. He was a sort of quite a angry sort of...
So what do you mean, sir? You'd met him?
I had met him.
Not through journalism?
Not through journalism.
Okay.
And I won't go into it for various
You don't want to go
reasons.
into the details of where you met him?
No, I met him. He was living in Dublin at that stage. He used to be around rap mines and in coffee shops. He was very public about his, the fact that he was off drugs now and he was reformed sort of guy. Very, very intense individual.
What was the impression you got from him apart from the intensity? Was he a bit edgy? Was he somebody?
I'd say he was. I thought he was quite dark in his nature. I saw him in company. This is very minor sort of stuff, but I thought he was quite domineering of people. He certainly had a lot of younger people around him. That he was. I mean, this is all very normal kind of human behavior, but he was very domineering of them. Very much, would take control of conversations and was, I thought he was quite sort of sinister in his nature. But this is all ahead of his conviction. This is all quite close to it. So I think he was convicted in 2006. Obviously, that the charges had been, it takes a while to get to court. In that time, he was still going on about being a long time off drinking drugs. But he had spoken when it came to court, of course, he wasn't being named until the point of conviction. So certainly he wasn't letting the people around him know that this was coming up.
So what happened? And you're talking in and around, you think prior to 2006, this rape occurred, and it's pretty horrific.
Yeah, the rape I think actually occurred in 2003.
Right.
And he was convicted in 2006. So certainly in between those years, he was floating around talking about, being, a model person to have, recover from his addiction and that sort of stuff. And
drawing people towards him.
But the reality was, when it came to court, his addiction was still the primary excuse he gave for this horrific rape that occurred. Now, I'll describe a bit of it to go through the sort of court copy. The victim, had described how she met Condra in a pub, and where she'd gone to organise a lunar event. Now, it's probably sort of a new agey sort of thing. And I think that were some of the circles that he was sort of moving in. At that stage, then, after that event, she was one of a number of people invited back to Condra's flat, where he produced, as she described, a tin of weed and told people to help themselves. He also had this medieval mead kind of, I suppose it's
an alcohol thing.
An alcohol thing, yeah. So she was preparing to leave, she describes, at around 2 a.m. in the morning. She was bending over to get her bag when he grabbed her, dragged her by the hair into his bedroom, punched her, threw her onto the bed, and said he was going to rape her. And then, it becomes very graphic how he continually raped her, punched her in the face, called her a whore and a bitch. She was screaming and begging to stop. Eventually, she sort of managed to phone the Gardaí at some point in the middle of this ordeal. After he realised that
I think she tried to. I'm not sure she got through to them. I think he came in and he took the mobile phone from her.
Sorry, you're right. And at that point, he told her she was going to pay for that he would kill her. He got a long bladed knife, held it to her throat, cut her with it. And at one point, I think she cut herself trying to push the knife away. In court, she said blood was flying everywhere. She was begging him to stop. He continued to hit her, and it went on till 7 a.m. in the morning. So, I mean...
That's 5 hours, a sustained attack over 5 hours, which is what it made it such a serious sexual, case, a serious assault, a serious rape. She eventually got out of that house, whether he fell asleep or she managed to escape some way was never really quite detailed. But she did get to the Garda station at 7:30 a.m. She reported it, and she was immediately taken from Drogheda to the Lourdes Hospital, and then onwards to the Rotunda to the sex assault unit, where she was examined. And obviously he was charged before the courts, but didn't plead guilty, pleaded not guilty, and continued to plead not guilty until the 5th day of the trial, or is it the 11th day of the trial?
I think it was day 6 of the 11-day trial, right. Or what was set aside for 11-day. Now, in the run-up to the case as well, there was all sorts of background stuff going on about where Condra had told a number of people about how this woman had made this up, was out to get him. There'd been very serious incidents where the woman had been made suffer by associates of Condra, without getting into it very specifically. And of course, the irony of all of that is that he did plead guilty only at the last minute, when he knew he was going to be found guilty. And so he didn't get too much credit for the guilty plea, but it just makes a mockery, because he was working.
He pleaded guilty to 2 of the charges, to assault causing harm and to aggravated sexual assault. He continued to plead not guilty to the kidnap of the woman, or the false imprisonment, and a rape charge.
Yeah.
And the jury went ahead, the trial went ahead. So he pleaded guilty to a bit and didn't plead guilty to the rest. The trial went ahead and he was found guilty on both those other charges.
Yeah.
An 11-1 majority. Sounds complicated. I suppose if you were sitting in the court, you might understand why somebody would plead guilty to 2 parts without a plea deal.
Well, I think he's trying to get credit for his guilty plea and sort of accepting, what was inevitable, in that there was obviously, we didn't sit through the days of it and know what was so.
But usually somebody will plead guilty to a number of charges. Say they're facing 4 or 5 charges. They might plead guilty to 2 on the basis that the other 3 are dropped. In the UK, I think they hold them on file.
Yeah.
But in this case, he just pleaded guilty to 2 of the charges in the middle of the 11-day trial. The 11-day trial continued to the end, where he was found guilty of the other 2, the more serious 2.
Yeah. And of course, the guards described it in court as extremely barbaric. The judge also said that the series of rapes were at the upper end of the scale, with a lot of savage violence and continuous threats of death involved. So, I mean, not to say that there is degrees of everything. The law recognises that even just for a woman to be put through that constant ordeal, with the threats of that she will be killed if she didn't do what she was told, and that threat was backed up with actual violence, with a knife being used, and so therefore Condra got a sentence just short of the minimum, and he was
The maximum,
which he was given 16 years for rape, 8 years for aggravated sexual assault, 3 years each for assault causing harm and false imprisonment, all to run concurrently. So, So he's been in jail ever since, and he served, 14 of the 16 years? Something like that. It might be slightly less. So he served really the absolute maximum, I'd say, of that sentence. He was in Arbour Hill, which was reserved for, a lot of the sex offenders are kept in Arbour Hill. It's a different type of prison than the other prisons across Ireland. It's really for prisoners. It can't be allowed mixed with other prisoners, really. Obviously, there are sex offender wings in places like the Midlands prison and various other prisons as well. Condra, it emerged halfway through that Condra had converted to Islam, had made some demands on the prison system in there in terms of meeting his religious needs. That's how that sort of became public. And after getting out,
So did he change his name to by deed poll, or is Hasan Selim his new name because he has converted to Muslim?
Well, I think both, actually, that he's changed it by deed poll.
What do you feel about that? Because I have come across, I can certainly name one in particular, very, very serious sexual offender, a guy called Michael Barbaric, who changed his name by deed poll while he was in prison. So he had a new identity when he came out. What do you make of that? I find that I think it's quite a sinister thing on the face of it for a sex offender to do. Now, they could argue that, they want a chance, they've served their time. They did the crime, they've served their time, and they want to come out and not be harassed in the way sexual offenders can within the community, that they want a chance to live a normal life. I do think it's slightly sinister for the people in jail, in prisons, to be changing their name by deed poll, their identity.
Yeah, I think it's not going to confuse the Gardaí, because that name change will be on.
Oh, and the sex offenders, it will, of course. But exactly. I mean, if you go back out into the world with a new name, you meet somebody. This guy's 63 now, and he looks completely different. He actually looks younger, I think, than when he was sentenced. And he's gone to a new community with a new religion, a new identity. Like, somebody is not going to find out anything about his background. No. And is that the reason?
Well, I mean, it can only be that reason, I think. Certainly we see a lot of sex offenders come out and use Irish names and absolutely want to, put that past behind them. I mean, Google has changed the world for sex offenders, I suppose, that, even a decade ago, people wouldn't have considered Googling somebody as soon as they know their name, but it's quite a routine practice now. Francis Condra, of course, has served his time. He served a lot of his adult life in jail at this point. And of course, everybody deserves a chance at rehabilitation. But I don't know that somebody of that type deserves the chance of anonymity or for his past not to be known. I think those are totally different things. People do deserve the chance, even people that have committed such horrible and heinous offences as Francis Condra, they do deserve another chance, but they don't deserve to just get this fresh blank slate where people don't know what they've done in the past. As I said, I have a memory of him. And for me, I think it's very important that people do know people that come across him. I think as well,
and a female relative, of course, who has a partner and 2 younger children, has taken him in the UK.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I don't know. I mean, he certainly was an intelligent and quite a compelling...
Manipulative.
Oh, I would think so. An intelligent person and probably an interesting and maybe even charismatic person. But I don't think this sinister aspect of his nature was deeply hidden. So people make their own choices with family. I mean, over the years, I've probably got dozens of phone calls from the family members of sex offenders. It's a very unusual call to get where, and your heart has to on some level go out to them, because there can't be anything worse than having somebody you love commit an offence like that and be convicted of it. But what can you say? I mean, it's nobody's fault but the person who's committed the offence. So I don't know.
And having served their time, they do have to live somewhere.
They have to live somewhere.
There's an age-old problem, where do they go? Nobody wants them beside them. If he's out kind of floating around the hostel, the homeless sort of services, is he more dangerous than if he's in a secure home?
No, I think it's better that they're in secure homes and it's better that people know where they are and who they are. But it is also important that the public see, this has gone to courts as well. I mean, there was a case involving a guy called Michael Murray who brought a case to the court saying that the newspapers weren't entitled to continue to write about him and that he had served his time and wanted to move on. This is and he'd been convicted of very serious sex crimes. But the courts kind of made a decision, and I'm paraphrasing now, that there was a public interest in his past being out there and that people would know who he is and that he does have a right to get on with his life, but he doesn't automatically have this right to have his past erased. And I think that's probably the right balance.
Because the sex offenders register, of course, is something we'd have no access to.
No.
The public has no access to. You have no idea who's living in your area in other parts of the world.
No.
The sex offenders register is practically an online tool.
Well, it is an online tool in America. I mean, you can go in the parts of America and, look at your address and see how many sex offenders
are living around you.
I mean, maybe that's going too far. But the idea that and I think there is a sense of that sometimes with these guys, people like Francis Condra and the people that are close to him. How dare you not let the guy live in peace. I don't believe that. I mean, he certainly does deserve to live in peace, but he doesn't deserve to be forgotten about and allowed insert himself in somewhere else and start.
And I suppose just to kind of finish on what happened with this interaction, because it's Underworld reporter and photographer was there to approach him. I presume, there is relevance to approaching these guys and ask them if there's something to say. If he stops and says he's, heartfelt sorry about what he did, he's reformed, he will never do anything like this again. They didn't get to talk to him, and when they did call to the door, having seen him go in, they were told nobody knew who he was and he wasn't living at that house.
Yeah. And I think, he's been a very manipulative figure, I think, through all this time. And look, he has to go and live with what he has done. But I do know, certainly in the run up to that, he wasn't putting forward the idea. He wasn't letting people know. And I remember people being really, really shocked because they were saying, well, I only saw him a couple of months ago and there was no mention of all of this. All we were hearing about.
No indication of anything.
All they were hearing about was his wonderful how much he was reformed and rehabilitated and how much he had to tell other people what they should be doing. But yeah, a funny memory, really.
Okay, Niall, thanks a million.
Thanks, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.